The fluorescent lights of the departure lounge hummed with a sterile, frantic energy, but inside the VIP lounge, the world was cushioned in velvet and hushed tones. Chloe adjusted her designer sunglasses, her eyes flitting across the luxury boutiques that lined the terminal like shrines to a god she worshipped daily. Beside her, her husband, Daniel, checked his watch, looking slightly uncomfortable as he glanced toward his mother, Elena. Elena sat quietly on a sleek leather bench, a small, worn carry-on bag at her feet. At 65, she possessed a stillness that Chloe often mistook for weakness. To Chloe, Elena was a relic of a simpler, poorer time. A woman whose hands smelled of garden soil and whose clothes, though neat, lacked the sharp, expensive edges of a woman of status. "Here are the boarding passes," Chloe announced, her voice bright and brittle, cutting through the lounge's peace. She began sliding the thick, gold-embossed first-class tickets into her leather organizer. "Daniel, you're in 2A. I'm in 2B. The kids are in the row behind us so they can have the flatbed seats." Daniel hesitated, his hand hovering near the stack. "And Mom? Where is she sitting?" Chloe didn't look up. She reached into the side pocket of her bag and pulled out a single, thin strip of thermal paper, a standard boarding pass, starkly different from the gold-leafed ones she held. She handed it to Elena without making eye contact. "Section 4. Seat 54B, Chloe said, her tone as cold as the air conditioning. "It's toward the back, Elena. It'll be quieter for you there, away from the bustle of the service galley." Daniel stared at the pass. "Seat 54B? Chloe, that's the very last row of economy. This is a 12-hour flight to Paris. Why isn't she in the cabin with us? There was plenty of room when we booked." Chloe's eyes flashed with a sharp, calculated annoyance. She leaned in closer to Daniel, though she made no effort to lower her voice enough to truly hide her words from Elena. "Daniel, let's be realistic. Your mother wouldn't even know how to operate a first-class pod. She'd be uncomfortable with the attention, the 5-course menus, the vintage wines. It's a waste of money." And slowly Elena stood up. She didn't head for the first-class entrance. She walked toward the long, snaking line of the general boarding gate. She stood among the backpackers, the tired families, and the students, looking like just another grandmother on a budget. As she stood in line, a young man bumped into her bag, apologizing profusely. Elena smiled at him, a genuine, warm expression that made the young man stop and blink. "It's quite all right, dear. We're all just trying to get to where we're going." She reached into her small bag and pulled out a pair of vintage, gold-rimmed reading glasses. Then, she pulled out a leather-bound journal. Inside were handwritten notes in French and Italian, names of boutique owners, and investment portfolios for some of the oldest fashion houses in the European Union. Chloe believed that status was something you bought with a ticket and wore on your sleeve. She believed that first class was a destination. But Elena knew better. Elena knew that true power didn't need to shout from the front of the plane. It didn't need silk pajamas or complimentary caviar to prove its existence. Status was a game Chloe was playing with Daniel's bank account. But the world they were flying into, the world of Parisian high fashion and ancient wealth, was a world Elena had helped build from the shadows. She boarded the plane and made the long trek down the narrow aisle. She passed the first-class cabin, seeing Chloe already tucked into her velvet seat, a glass of champagne in her hand, her face buried in a luxury catalog. Chloe didn't even look up as Elena walked past. To Chloe, Elena had already become invisible. Elena reached row 54. The seat was cramped, the window was scratched, and the air was thin. She sat down, tucked her bag under the seat in front of her, and opened her journal. A flight attendant, looking harried and tired, stopped by. "Can I get you some water, ma'am?" "No, thank you," Elena said kindly. "But if you have a moment later, I would love a cup of tea. Just plain black tea." The attendant softened, a rare smile appearing on her face. "Of course. I'll make sure it's a fresh pot." As the engines began to roar, and the plane pushed back from the gate, Elena looked out the scratched window. Chloe thought she was punishing her mother-in-law by putting her in the back of the plane. She thought she was asserting her dominance by separating their levels of existence. But as the wheels left the tarmac, Elena felt only a quiet sense of anticipation. She had spent a lifetime investing in things that lasted: fabrics, craftsmanship, and people. Chloe was an investment that was about to turn into a very public liability. Elena closed her eyes as the plane leveled out. 12 hours. It was a long time to sit in a cramped seat, but for Elena, it was simply the final countdown. Chloe wanted to play at being a socialite in the city of light. She wanted to walk through doors she thought her husband's money had opened. She had no idea that the woman she had left in 54B was the one who held the keys to every single one of them. The low, rhythmic thrum of the Boeing 777's engines vibrated through the thin cushion of seat 54B, a constant reminder of the miles of ocean stretching beneath the aircraft. Elena leaned her temple against the cold plastic of the window frame, watching the moonlight dance upon a blanket of clouds that looked like a frozen sea. In the dim cabin twilight, the air was thick with the sounds of 100 strangers in forced proximity. The rustle of polyester blankets, the soft clicking of touchscreens, and the occasional heavy sigh of those struggling to find comfort in chairs that were never designed for rest. Elena shifted her weight, her knees brushing against the rigid back of the seat in front of her. Her mind drifted forward, past the heavy blue curtains and the galley partitions, to the sanctuary where Chloe and Daniel were currently sequestered. She could almost see Chloe, tucked beneath a high-thread count duvet, her seat fully reclined into a flat bed as she sipped vintage wine from a crystal flute. To Chloe, luxury was not just a comfort, it was a weapon of differentiation. She had banished Elena to the back of the plane not out of a lack of funds, but out of a desperate need to establish a hierarchy, to prove that Elena's simplicity made her fundamentally incompatible with the sophisticated world Chloe intended to conquer. Reaching into the seatback pocket, Elena pulled out her small, leather-bound journal. She didn't need the overhead light. Her eyes had long ago adjusted to the gloom, and the ink on the pages was as familiar to her as the lines on her own palms. She flipped through the entries, her fingers tracing the names of old friends, directors of heritage fashion houses, master silk weavers in Lyon, and silent partners who controlled the very fabric of the Parisian economy. Chloe saw Elena as a rustic relic of Daniel's past, a woman whose only value lay in her grandmotherly presence. She had no inkling that the woman she had relegated to 54B was the silent heartbeat of the industry she worshipped from afar. For the last 3 years, Elena had watched Chloe's slow, calculated campaign to reshape Daniel. She had seen her son's natural kindness replaced by a hollow ambition, his eyes now constantly fixed on the next rung of a social ladder that led nowhere. Chloe had convinced him that his mother was a liability, a woman who would embarrass them in front of the refined elite they were traveling to meet. Earlier at the gate, Chloe's whisper had been sharp enough to cut, that Elena wouldn't know how to handle the sophistication of first class. It was a cruel, unnecessary blow, but Elena had accepted it with a serene mask, knowing that the greatest power often resides in those whom others choose to ignore. 6 hours into the flight, the harried flight attendant Elena had befriended earlier returned. She moved quietly down the darkened aisle, her face pale with fatigue. She stopped at Elena's row and leaned in close, holding a small porcelain cup that looked out of place in the economy cabin. "I snagged a bit of Earl Grey from the premium galley," the attendant whispered, her voice warm with a secret kindness. "And a few of the shortbread biscuits. You look like you could use something better than the instant stuff we serve back here." Elena took the cup, the warmth seeping into her tired fingers. "You are an angel, Sarah. Thank you." The attendant started, her eyes widening. "How did you know my name?" Elena nodded toward the small silver name tag pinned to the woman's vest. "I make it a point to notice the people who actually keep the world moving, Sarah. Most people only look at the uniform or the service. I prefer to look at the person." Sarah's expression softened, a genuine moment of connection bridging the gap between a service worker and a passenger in a space designed for anonymity. "Enjoy your tea, ma'am. If you need a walk later, the back galley is quiet." Elena watched her go, reflecting on the irony of Chloe's world. Chloe believed that status was something that commanded service, a tool to make others feel small. Elena knew that true status was something that inspired respect, a tool to make others feel seen. Unable to find sleep, Elena stood up and made her way to the back of the aircraft. She stood by the small porthole in the exit door, looking out at the cold, brilliant stars at 38,000 feet. Her thoughts drifted to the Valmont group, the high-stakes meeting that was the primary reason for this trip. Chloe believed that by showcasing Daniel as a polished, wealthy executive, she could secure a partnership that would cement their place in Parisian society. She had spent months rehearsing her French and curating a wardrobe of new money labels. She had no idea that the Valmont Group was currently in the midst of a silent crisis, their shares plummeting due to a supply chain failure that only a deep understanding of heritage manufacturing could fix. She had no idea that the directors Chloe was so eager to impress were desperately searching for a legendary, reclusive investor known only as Madame E, a woman whose discretion was as famous as her wealth. And Chloe certainly had no idea that the simple woman she had left in the back of the plane was the only person with the power to save the very company she hoped to join. Elena sipped her tea, the bergamot refreshing her senses against the stale cabin air. Chloe's arrogance was a shield, but it was also a blindfold. She was so focused on the hierarchy of the airplane that she had failed to perceive the reality of the world waiting for them on the ground. Chloe had put Elena in the back of the plane to prove she was less than. But in doing so, she had given Elena the perfect vantage point. From the back, one could see the entire cabin. One could see who was anxious, who was arrogant, and who was merely playing a part. As she walked back to her seat, Elena passed a young mother in row 42 who was struggling to settle a crying infant. The woman looked on the verge of tears herself, her eyes darting around the cabin in apology for the noise. Elena didn't offer a lecture or a condescending smile. Instead, she reached into her bag, pulled out an unopened bottle of water and a clean, silk handkerchief, and handed them to the woman with a small, encouraging nod. The woman's tension seemed to melt instantly. She didn't need a savior, she just needed to know she wasn't alone in her struggle. Back in 54B, Elena tucked the thin blue blanket around her legs. She thought of Daniel, the son who had once valued character over currency, and hoped he wasn't yet entirely lost to Chloe's influence. Daniel was an investment Elena wasn't ready to abandon. Chloe, however, was a luxury that had become far too expensive for the family's soul. The aircraft tilted slightly, banking toward the European coast as the first hints of dawn began to bleed across the horizon. Elena closed her eyes, her mind already navigating the cobblestone streets of Paris. A city that didn't care about the class of your ticket, but never forgot the weight of your name. Chloe was worried about the shuttle to the hotel. Elena was simply going home to a city she helped own. She drifted into a light sleep, the crumpled economy boarding pass, sitting forgotten on the floor. It had served its purpose. It had shown Elena exactly who Chloe was when she believed there were no consequences for her cruelty. Now, Elena was ready to show Chloe exactly who the old lady was when the world was watching. The first light of dawn began to bleed through the scratched plastic of the window in row 54. A thin ribbon of bruised purple and orange that illuminated the fatigue on the faces of the passengers around Elena. The cabin crew moved through the aisles with a quiet, practiced urgency, their movements stiff from the long hours of the transatlantic crossing. Elena sat up, smoothing her skirt with her palms, her eyes clear and alert despite the cramped quarters. Across the cabin, the heavy blue curtains that separated the classes were finally drawn back, revealing the plush, airy sanctuary of the first-class cabin where Chloe and Daniel were beginning to stir. As the descent into Paris began, the captain's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing the arrival at Charles de Gaulle Airport. Elena could imagine Chloe in the front, fastidiously checking her makeup in a lighted mirror, ensuring every hair was in place for her grand entrance into the city she believed she was about to dominate. To Chloe, the landing was the start of her coronation. To Elena, it was simply the next step in a long-overdue revelation. The plane touched down with a gentle jolt, the tires shrieking against the rain-slicked tarmac of the French runway. As the aircraft taxied toward the gate, the frantic energy of the passengers increased, but Elena remained in her seat until the very last row was cleared. She watched as the first-class passengers, including her family, were ushered off first, disappearing into the jet bridge with an air of unearned superiority. Chloe didn't look back, her mind already on the luggage carousel and the high-society contacts she hoped to impress. Elena finally gathered her small bag and walked through the terminal, her pace steady and unhurried. By the time she reached the baggage claim, she saw Chloe standing near the oversized luggage belt, looking frustrated. Daniel stood beside her, checking his phone. His shoulders hunched as he listened to Chloe's sharp complaints about the inefficiency of French ground crews. "There she is," Chloe said, her voice dripping with a faux pity that made a few nearby travelers wince. She didn't move to help Elena. Instead, she adjusted her designer tote and pointed toward the exit. "Elena, we really need to hurry. The shuttle for the hotel will be here in 10 minutes, and I have a lunch meeting with the Valmont representatives at noon. We can't be late because you're moving slowly." Daniel looked at his mother, a flicker of the old kindness in his eyes, but he remained silent as Chloe pulled him toward the sliding glass doors. "Mom, are you okay?" "The flight back there was probably rough," he murmured as they stepped into the damp, gray morning air of Paris. "It was enlightening, Daniel," Elena replied softly, her eyes fixed on Chloe's back. Chloe stopped at the curb, her eyes scanning the sea of taxis and shuttle buses for the standard van they had booked. She looked at Elena's simple coat and frowned, stepping a few feet away as if to distance herself from someone she considered a social liability. "Stand over there, Elena," Chloe commanded, gesturing toward a luggage cart. "We're meeting a very important courier here. I don't want the first impression of the Vance family to be, well, cluttered." Elena didn't move to the luggage cart. Instead, she looked past the line of yellow taxis to where a sleek, black stretch limousine was gliding toward the curb, its tinted windows reflecting the overcast sky like polished obsidian. It was an apex of luxury, a vehicle that commanded the attention of everyone in the terminal. Chloe's eyes widened as the car slowed to a halt directly in front of them. "Look at that, Daniel," she whispered, her voice filled with a hungry envy. "That must be for a celebrity or a high-ranking diplomat. That's the kind of status we're aiming for. One day, we won't be taking shuttles." The driver, a tall man in a flawlessly tailored black suit and pristine white gloves, stepped out of the vehicle. He ignored Chloe's attempts to catch his eye and walked directly past her and Daniel. Chloe actually stepped back, assuming he was clearing the way for someone important behind her. The chauffeur stopped in front of Elena. He removed his cap and bowed deeply, a gesture of profound, archaic respect that seemed to freeze the very air in the terminal. "Welcome home, Madam Chairwoman," the chauffeur said in fluent, elegant French, though he repeated it in English for the benefit of the stunned onlookers. "The apartment on the Rue du Faubourg is ready, and the board of the Valmont Group is awaiting your arrival at the atelier. May I take your bag?" The silence that followed was absolute. Chloe's mouth hung open, her face draining of color until she looked like a ghost in her expensive silk blazer. Daniel stared at his mother, as if she had suddenly transformed into a stranger before his eyes. The simple woman they had relegated to seat 54B was being treated like royalty by a man who wouldn't even look at Chloe. "Elena." Chloe stammered, her voice cracking. What is this? Who is this man?" Elena took a step toward the open door of the limousine, but she paused, looking back at Chloe. For the first time, she allowed the full weight of her presence to be felt, the quiet authority she had honed over decades of silent leadership. "This is my driver, Chloe," Elena said, her voice as smooth and cold as the marble in a Parisian bank. "And as for the status you were so worried about, I believe you mentioned that I wouldn't fit in with the sophistication of your meetings." Elena looked at her son, her expression softening only slightly. "Daniel, you have spent so much time looking up at people like Chloe that you forgot to look at the people who actually built the world you're trying to join. I am the primary investor Chloe has been trying to meet with. I am the reason the Valmont Group still has a name." Chloe began to babble, her hands shaking as she clutched her boarding pass for the shuttle bus. "I didn't know. Elena, please, it was just a joke. The seats, we thought you'd be more comfortable." "You thought I was beneath you," Elena interrupted, not with anger, but with a terrifying, absolute clarity. "You put me in the back of the plane to prove a point. Well, the point has been proven. You value the seat, Chloe. I value the ground it lands on." Elena stepped into the plush, leather interior of the limousine. The chauffeur began to close the door, but Elena held up a hand for a second. "Enjoy your shuttle, Chloe," Elena said with a faint, graceful smile. "And Daniel, I suggest you think very carefully about which class of person you truly belong with. I'll be at the atelier, if you can find it." The door closed with a solid, expensive thud. The limousine pulled away from the curb, leaving Chloe and Daniel standing in the drizzle, surrounded by their designer luggage, and the hollow remains of a status that had just been shattered by the woman from economy. Elena leaned back into the seat, looking out at the Eiffel Tower appearing through the mist. Finally home. The black limousine glided through the rain-slick streets of Paris, the interior a sanctuary of silent, climate-controlled luxury that felt worlds away from the damp turmoil Elena had left behind at the airport terminal. Elena leaned back against the supple leather, watching the iconic gray facades of the Haussmann buildings flicker past like ghosts of an era she understood better than anyone. In her hand, she held the small leather journal that Chloe had once looked upon with such disdain. But now its pages felt like a map to a kingdom Elena had reclaimed. Outside, the world was waking up to a Tuesday in the city of light, but inside the car, there was only the quiet hum of an impending reckoning. Elena thought of Chloe and Daniel, likely still standing at the curb, their designer luggage dampening in the drizzle as they waited for a shuttle bus that now felt like a humiliation. Chloe's obsession with status had blinded her to the reality that power is not something you display. It is something you possess. By banishing Elena to row 54, Chloe had attempted to erase her, but in doing so, she had only highlighted her own shallow vanity. The limousine turned onto the Rue du Faubourg Saint-Honoré, the heart of Parisian high fashion, where the windows of the world's most prestigious ateliers shimmered with gold leaf and silk. The car slowed as it approached a discreet, heavy iron gate that led to the private courtyard of the Valmont Group's headquarters. This was the building Chloe had spent months dreaming about, the place she believed would be the stage for her social coronation. She had no idea that the simple woman she had patronized for years was the one who held the deed to the very ground she stood on. As the gates swung open, a row of staff stood in wait. These were not just employees. They were artisans and executives who had worked under Elena's quiet guidance for decades. They didn't see a tired grandmother from economy. They saw the architect of their survival. The chauffeur opened the door, and Elena stepped out, the cool Parisian air invigorating her senses. Madame, a gray-haired man in an impeccable navy suit stepped forward, bowing slightly. It was Jean-Luc, the CEO of Valmont, a man Chloe would have given anything to even glimpse in a hallway. The board is in the salon. They were quite concerned when they heard you flew commercial. Elena offered a faint, graceful smile. It was an experiment in perspective, Jean-Luc. It's important to remember what the world looks like from the back of the plane. Jean-Luc chuckled, though his eyes remained serious. The Vance family, your son and his wife, have sent several urgent messages. They arrived at their hotel and are demanding to be moved up the meeting schedule. The wife, Chloe, is quite insistent that they are priority guests. Elena paused at the entrance to the grand salon, her eyes reflecting the crystal light of the chandeliers. Let them wait, Jean-Luc. In fact, let them wait in the lobby. I want them to see exactly what status looks like when it is earned, not performed. Inside the salon, the atmosphere was thick with the scent of beeswax and expensive tobacco. The directors of the Valmont Group sat around a massive mahogany table, their faces etched with the stress of the brand's recent supply chain crisis. They looked up as Elena entered, and the tension in the room seemed to evaporate instantly. Elena took her seat at the head of the table, the seat Chloe believed belonged to her own husband, and opened her journal. We have 3 hours before the scheduled meeting with the Vance representatives, Elena began, her voice commanding the room with a soft, absolute authority. By then, I want the full audit of our silk suppliers ready. If Chloe wants to talk about sophistication, we will show her the reality of the industry she thinks she can buy into with a first-class ticket. Meanwhile, across the city, the hotel lobby of the Ritz was a scene of whispered chaos. Chloe paced the marble floor, her silk blazer wrinkled from the damp air, and her eyes darting toward the gold-rimmed clock on the wall. Daniel sat on a nearby velvet chair, his head in his hands. The revelation at the airport had shattered him. He was no longer the confident executive Chloe had tried to create, but a son who realized he had betrayed the one person who truly loved him. How could she do this? Chloe hissed, her voice trembling with a mix of fury and terror. All those years, she let us think she was just a burden. She sat in the back of the plane. She let me treat her like a servant. She didn't let you do anything, Chloe, Daniel said quietly, his voice hollow. You chose to treat her that way. You wanted to prove you were better than her, So she let you see exactly what you look like when you think no one is watching. Chloe stopped pacing, her face pale. We have to fix this, Daniel. If she's the investor, our entire future is in her hands. If we don't get this meeting, we lose everything. I think we've already lost Chloe, Daniel replied, looking up at his wife with a clarity he hadn't possessed in years. You were so worried about the seat on the plane that you didn't realize you were already falling. Back at the Valmont atelier, Elena walked through the workshop where the autumn collection was being assembled. She touched the fabric of a half-finished gown, her fingers recognizing the quality of the weave. This was what Chloe didn't understand. Status wasn't a label or a boarding pass, it was the work of 1,000 hours. It was the loyalty of the people who made the world move. As the clock struck noon, the heavy doors of the atelier opened. Chloe and Daniel were ushered in, looking small and out of place in the grand, high-ceilinged room. Chloe had tried to fix her makeup and hair, but the desperation in her eyes was impossible to hide. She looked at the directors, then at Jean-Luc, and finally, her gaze landed on Elena, who sat at the center of the workshop, surrounded by the finest fashion minds in Europe. The silence was absolute. Chloe attempted a smile, a shaky, pleading expression that made Jean-Luc look away in embarrassment. Elena, Chloe began, her voice cracking. We were so surprised at the airport. We had no idea you were so involved here. If we had known, of course, we would have arranged everything differently. Elena stood up slowly, her simple gray coat a stark contrast to the flamboyant luxury around her. She didn't look at Chloe with anger, but with a profound, weary disappointment. If you had known, Elena repeated softly. That is the tragedy, isn't it, Chloe? You only offer respect when you think it will buy you something. You only see value when it is wrapped in gold leaf. Elena turned to the board of directors. These are the representatives Daniel and Chloe brought to meet with us. They wish to discuss sophistication and status. She looked back at Chloe, her eyes as cold as the Seine in winter. But as I learned in row 54, Chloe, you don't actually understand either. You spent the entire flight looking down on the very people who built the cabin you sat in. You thought the back of the plane was a punishment. But for me, it was a reminder of who I am. Elena closed her journal with a sharp, final thud. The Valmont Group is no longer seeking a partnership with the Vance family. Daniel, you are my son, and you will always have a place at my table. But Chloe, you are no longer welcome at the palace. The security guard stepped forward, a silent, black-suited wall that began to usher the stunned couple toward the exit. Chloe began to cry, the realization finally hitting her that the world she had tried so hard to conquer had just closed its doors forever. As they were let out, Elena returned to the fabric on the table, her mind already back on the work that truly mattered. Chloe had wanted to be a queen in Paris, but she was leaving as a stranger, finally learning that the view from the back of the plane is often the most accurate one of all. The heavy oak doors of the Valmont atelier closed with a resonant, final thud, leaving a lingering silence that felt heavier than the ornate gold-leafed ceilings of the grand salon. Outside in the cobblestone courtyard, the rain had turned into a cold, persistent mist, mirroring the gray despair that had finally settled over Chloe and Daniel. They stood by the iron gates, their designer luggage looking like abandoned props from a play that had been cancelled mid-performance. Chloe's silk blazer was damp, her carefully curated status melting away with every drop of Parisian rain. We have to do something, Chloe whispered, her voice trembling not with sadness, but with the frantic terror of a social climber who had just watched the ladder disintegrate. Daniel, talk to her. She's your mother. She can't just cast us out like this. Not after we flew all this way. Not after the first-class seats and the hotel. Daniel looked at his wife, and for the first time in years he didn't see the sophisticated partner he had tried to become for her. He saw a stranger whose obsession with labels had cost him his dignity and his family. The memory of the airport terminal flashed through his mind. The way Chloe had looked at Elena as if she were a piece of discarded luggage. The way she had mocked the simplicity of a woman who actually owned the world Chloe was desperate to join. The first-class seats were the problem, Chloe, Daniel said, his voice hollow and tired. You thought putting her in row 54 made you a queen, but all it did was show her that you weren't worthy of sitting at her table. You didn't just put her in economy. You tried to put her out of our lives. And now she's simply returning the favor. Inside the atelier, Elena walked slowly through the cutting room. The scent of expensive silk and cedar wood grounding her after the transatlantic ordeal. She didn't feel the rush of a victor. She felt only the quiet, weary peace of a woman who had finally cleared her house of clutter. Jean-Luc walked beside her, his expression a mixture of profound respect and cautious curiosity. "Madam," he said softly, "the board is ready to discuss the restructuring. The Vance family's departure has left a few administrative gaps in the subsidiary plans, but nothing we cannot handle with your direct oversight." Elena stopped at a large window overlooking the Rue du Faubourg Saint-Honoré. From this height, the people on the street looked small, a sea of umbrellas moving in rhythmic patterns. Somewhere down there, she knew her son was wandering the streets, finally forced to confront the reality of the woman he had married. "The gaps are opportunities, Jean-Luc," Elena replied, her voice steady and clear. "Status is a funny thing. People like Chloe think it's a destination, a seat, a label, a limousine. But true status is the ability to walk away when the room is no longer honorable. I spent 12 hours in seat 54B watching the world from the back, and I realized that we have been focusing too much on the first-class image of this brand and not enough on the people who actually wear the clothes." She turned back to the room, her eyes sharp and focused. "We will not be replacing the Vance partnership with another socialite firm. We are going to invest in the artisans. I want a scholarship fund for the weavers in Lyon and the tanners in Florence. If Chloe wants to talk about sophistication, we will show her that it starts in the dirt and the sweat of the workshop, not in the plush cushions of an airplane pod." As the afternoon light faded into a deep Parisian blue, Elena sat in her private office, the small leather journal open on her desk. She had spent years as a silent investor, watching from the shadows as the world changed around her. She had let Chloe believe she was a burden because she wanted to see if her son would defend the values she had raised him with. He had failed that test at the boarding gate, but perhaps in the cold light of a Parisian evening without a trust fund to catch him, he might find his way back. A soft knock came at the door. Jean-Luc entered, holding a small silver tray with a single envelope. "A message from the Ritz, madam. From your son." Elena didn't open it immediately. She knew what it would say: apologies, explanations, please for a second chance. She looked at the gold-rimmed clock on her mantel, the rhythmic ticking the only sound in the grand room. Chloe had wanted to be a queen in Paris, but queens were made of stronger stuff than silk and ego. "Leave it, Jean-Luc," Elena said quietly. "I have a dinner meeting with the director of the Louvre tonight. And after that, I think I'll take a walk by the Seine. It's been a long time since I walked this city as just Elena, and not as the old lady someone is trying to hide." She stood up, smoothing her simple gray coat. She had landed in Paris as a passenger in economy, a woman dismissed by those who thought they were her superiors. But as she walked out of the atelier, the staff bowing in silent unison as she passed, Elena knew that the view from row 54 had been the most valuable investment she had ever made. It had shown her the truth of her family, the strength of her legacy, and the simple, undeniable fact that the person in the back of the plane is often the only one who truly knows where it's going. Chloe and Daniel were gone, relegated to the sidelines of a story they thought they were leading. Elena stepped into the waiting limousine, the chauffeur closing the door with that same solid, expensive thud. The city of light twinkled outside, a world of craftsmanship and history that didn't care about your boarding pass, but deeply respected your soul. Elena leaned back, finally at rest, a chairwoman who had found her power exactly where she had left it, in the quiet, unshakable dignity of a simple woman who knew exactly who she was. The evening air in Paris was crisp, carrying the scent of rain-dampened stone and the sweet, buttery aroma of distant pâtisseries. Elena stood on the balcony of her apartment on the Rue du Faubourg Saint-Honoré, watching the lights of the city flicker like fallen stars. Below, the streets were alive with the rhythmic hum of late-night traffic and the distant laughter of people who believed the night was young. For Elena, the night felt ancient and full of a quiet, settled truth. She retreated inside, the heavy silk curtains muffling the sounds of the world outside. The apartment was a masterpiece of understated elegance. Parquet floors that gleamed like honey, walls adorned with sketches from the masters of the 1920s, and furniture that had been crafted by hands long since gone. It was a place Chloe had never been invited to, a sanctuary that remained a mystery to the woman who believed she knew everything about Elena's simple life. A quiet chime echoed from the hallway. Elena walked toward the door, her movements graceful and unhurried. When she opened it, she found Daniel standing there. He looked smaller than he had at the airport. His shoulders slumped and his eyes hollow with a deep, crushing exhaustion. He wasn't wearing his designer blazer anymore. He was in a simple sweater, looking more like the son she remembered from years ago. "Mom," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Can I come in?" Elena stepped aside, gesturing for him to enter. Daniel walked into the living room and stopped, his eyes widening as he took in the grandeur of the space. He looked at the original Chanel sketches on the wall, and the priceless antique clock on the mantel. He looked at his mother, who stood by the fireplace, looking perfectly at home in a room that cost more than his entire suburban house. "I didn't know," Daniel murmured, shaking his head. "All this time. I had no idea." "You didn't look, Daniel," Elena said softly, though there was a weight of disappointment in her words. "You were so busy looking at what Chloe wanted you to see that you forgot to look at what was right in front of you. You let her convince you that I was a burden to be managed, a social liability to be hidden away in the back of a plane." Daniel sank into a velvet armchair, burying his face in his hands. "She's at the hotel. She's frantic, Mom. She's trying to call everyone, the Valmont board, the hotel manager, the press. She thinks if she can just explain the misunderstanding, you'll change your mind. She thinks she can still save the partnership." "There is no misunderstanding," Elena replied, her voice firm and absolute. "Chloe showed me exactly who she is when she thought I had no power. She showed me that her respect is a currency she only spends on those she fears or wants something from. She put me in row 54 not because we lacked money, but because she wanted to prove that I was beneath her." Elena walked to the window, her back to her son. "I sat in that cramped seat for 12 hours, Daniel. I watched the flight attendants work themselves to exhaustion while people in the front complained about the temperature of their champagne. I realized that your wife has spent her life trying to buy her way into a class of people who have no soul, and I realized that you were letting her turn you into one of them." "I'm sorry," Daniel choked out, a sob breaking through his voice. "I was a coward. I should have stood up to her at the gate. I should have put you in that first-class seat myself." "No," Elena said, turning to face him. "You should have realized that I didn't need the seat. I needed a son who valued his mother more than his social standing. The flight was an investment, Daniel. It cost me 12 hours of comfort, but it bought me the truth. It showed me that the woman you married is a liability to the legacy I spent 40 years building." The silence that followed was heavy, filled with the ticking of the antique clock. Daniel looked up, his eyes red. "What happens now?" "She's talking about a divorce if we lose the Valmont connection. She says I ruined everything." "Chloe didn't lose the connection because of you, Daniel. She lost it because of her own arrogance," Elena said. She walked to her desk and picked up a small, sealed envelope. "This is a plane ticket. It's for tomorrow morning. Economy class. One way back home." Daniel stared at the envelope. "For me." "For Chloe," Elena corrected. "I have already instructed my lawyers to settle the hotel bill and provide her with enough funds to return home. But she is no longer part of this trip, and she is no longer part of the Valmont future. As for you, that is up to you. You can follow her back to the world of labels and lies, or you can stay here and learn what it actually takes to run a house like this." "You'd let me stay?" "I'd let you work," Elena said, her eyes flashing with a spark of the fierce chairwoman she had become. "You will start at the bottom, Daniel. Not in an office but in the warehouse in Lyon. You will learn the feel of the silk and the weight of the looms. You will learn the names of the people Chloe thought were beneath her. And perhaps in a year or two, you might be worthy of sitting at this table." Daniel looked at the ticket, then at his mother. He stood up slowly, his posture straightening for the first time in days. He didn't reach for the ticket meant for Chloe. He walked toward his mother and took her hand, his grip firm and desperate. "I don't want to go back," he said. "I want to remember who I was before I met her." Elena squeezed his hand, a small, weary smile finally reaching her eyes. "Then go to the guest room, Daniel. Get some sleep. Tomorrow the work begins. As Daniel walked down the hallway, Elena returned to the balcony. The rain had stopped, and the moon was rising over the rooftops of Paris. Chloe was likely still at the Ritz, surrounded by the luxury she worshipped, yet more alone than she had ever been. She had tried to banish Elena to the back of the plane to prove her dominance, but in the end, she was the one who had been relegated to the sidelines of a life she never truly owned. Elena leaned against the cold stone railing, finally feeling the weight of the journey lift from her shoulders. The view from row 54 had been difficult, but it had led her exactly where she needed to be. She was no longer just the simple woman Chloe had tried to hide. She was Elena, the woman who knew that true status isn't about where you sit, but about the strength of the soul you bring to the seat. The city of light twinkled in the dark, a silent witness to a grandmother who had reclaimed her kingdom, one boarding pass at a time. The first light of a Parisian Wednesday broke over the limestone facades of the Rue du Faubourg Saint-Honoré, casting long, elegant shadows across Elena's parquet floors. Inside the apartment, the air was still and smelled of fresh espresso and the faint, lingering scent of jasmine from the balcony. Elena sat at her mahogany desk, her leather-bound journal open to a fresh page. She had already dressed for the day in a simple, charcoal wool suit, and the pearl necklace her father had given her 40 years ago. There were no designer logos on her person, yet she looked more like the master of her surroundings than any socialite at the Ritz ever could. A soft knock came at the door and Jean-Luc entered, carrying a leather portfolio and a small, silver tray with the morning papers. His expression was professional, but there was a twinkle of admiration in his eyes. "Madam," he said, bowing slightly, "the car is ready for the airport. The luggage for the young Madam, Chloe, has already been sent ahead to the terminal. As per your instructions, she was checked out of the Ritz at 6 this morning." Elena took a slow sip of her coffee, her gaze fixed on the quiet street below. "And my son, Daniel, is already at the warehouse in Lyon, Madam," Jean-Luc replied. "He took the early train. He left a note for you." He seemed resolute. Elena felt a quiet swell of pride. Daniel had chosen the hard path, the path of work and humility, over the hollow comfort Chloe offered. It was the first real decision he had made for himself in years, and it was the only one that could save his soul. "And Chloe?" Elena asked, her voice neutral. Jean-Luc hesitated. "She was quite vocal during the checkout process, Madam. She insisted there had been a legal error. However, once she saw the one-way ticket in the envelope, she became very quiet. She is currently at Charles de Gaulle, awaiting the boarding call for flight AF022. Seat 54B, I assume?" Elena asked, a faint, ironical smile touching her lips. "Exactly as you requested, Madam. The very last row. Right next to the galley." Elena stood up, smoothing her jacket. "Then it is time. I want to be there to see the doors close." The drive to the airport was silent. Elena watched Paris glide by, the Seine, the Louvre, the Arc de Triomphe. She had spent a lifetime building a legacy in this city. A legacy Chloe had tried to treat as a mere backdrop for her Instagram feed. Chloe had wanted to be a queen in the city of light, but she had failed to realize that true queens are defined by their service to the craft, not their proximity to the throne. When they arrived at the terminal, Elena didn't go to the private lounge or the VIP wing. She walked straight to the general boarding gate for the flight back to the United States. She stood at a distance, obscured by a pillar, watching the crowd. She saw Chloe. The younger woman looked exhausted. Her silk blazer was wrinkled, her hair was a mess of unkempt curls, and she was clutching her oversized designer tote as if it were a life raft. She was standing in the long, slow-moving line for economy boarding. She looked small. She looked ordinary. She looked exactly like the woman she had tried to pretend she wasn't. Every time a first-class passenger walked past her toward the priority lane, Chloe flinched. She watched the gold-leaf boarding passes with a look of pure, unadulterated agony. She was finally experiencing the authentic flight experience she had so cruelly prescribed for Elena 12 hours earlier. As Chloe reached the gate agent, she handed over the thin thermal paper ticket. The agent scanned it and pointed toward the long jet bridge. "Group 4, ma'am. All the way to the back. Enjoy your flight." Chloe paused, looking back at the terminal one last time. For a brief second, Her eyes scanned the crowd, perhaps hoping to see Daniel, or perhaps hoping to see a limousine waiting to rescue her from her own consequences. Her gaze passed right over Elena, who stood perfectly still in the shadows. To Chloe, the people in the terminal were still invisible. She had learned nothing. Elena watched until Chloe's head disappeared into the jet bridge. Only then did she turn away. "Is that all, madam?" Jean-Luc asked, stepping up beside her. "No," Elena said, her voice reclaiming its full commanding power. "Now we go to the atelier. We have a heritage to rebuild, and I want to see the new weaver's designs before lunch. The back of the plane taught me many things, Jean-Luc, but the most important is that you can't see the future if you're too busy looking at the menu in first class." As they walked back toward the exit, Elena felt a lightness she hadn't known in years. She had landed in Paris as a grandmother being bullied by a shallow daughter-in-law. She was leaving the airport as the sovereign of her own life. She had used the very weapon Chloe had intended for her humiliation, the economy seat, and turned it into a mirror that showed the world exactly who Chloe was. 12 hours in seat 54B had been a small price to pay for the truth. Elena stepped into the limousine, the door closing with that familiar, heavy thud. As the car pulled away from the airport, heading back into the heart of the city she loved, she opened her journal to a fresh page. She didn't write about first-class luxury or the sting of Chloe's insults. She wrote about the weight of the silk. She wrote about the loyalty of the staff. And she wrote about her son, who was finally learning how to stand on his own 2 feet. Chloe was in the back of a plane, flying toward a life that no longer belonged to her, surrounded by the people she had spent her life trying to avoid. But Elena was in Paris, surrounded by the world she had built, finally free. The city of light shone through the window, bright and unapologetic. Elena leaned back, a small, graceful smile on her face. The view from row 54 had been difficult, but it had led her to the most beautiful vista of all. The sight of a family finally being held to account, and a legacy finally being placed in the right hands. The flight was over. The work had begun. And Madame E was finally home.